Thank you all. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, this beautiful introduction. I'm deeply humbled, and I still don't have any money. Right? My husband said, "Does that award come with any money?" It's the life of an artist. I feel what I'm going to do, I'm going to hopefully talk for just about 45 minutes to an hour. And I'm going to start with looking at other artists because I enjoy looking at other artists. For instance, David Driscoll is in the audience. An extraordinary man who has done so much for so many artists in this country. Bonita Bing is in this audience, who organizes a very important event every year celebrating photographers, African American photographers. And was kind enough to present me this year with an award, the Gordon Parks Award. And I said to her last night and to the Gordon Parks Foundation, and thinking about Gordon Parks and in thinking about the many artists that I feel deeply influenced by, artists that have widened the path for me, artists that make what I do possible, is though in the case, for instance, of Gordon, or in the case of David Driscoll, when Sugar Ray Robinson was asked what he thought about Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray said, "I came to see myself as a boxer and him as history." So I see myself as a boxer, just trying to figure out a number of things as I kind of wade through this very complicated life that we live. I feel like I'm just a little dust particle trying to attach myself to a time and to a place, and anchored in that time and place and in this extraordinary place of mystery, of upset, of resolve. There are a group of artists that really shepherd me through because they've made their work, whether they are African American or women or men, doesn't really matter, that they have simply worked, that they have simply tried to infuse life with deep and complicated and complex meaning, because really that's what it is. What is this mystery that we are involved in? How do we make our way through this thing? You know, so whether I'm looking at film or whether I'm looking at text, whether I'm looking at photographs, it really doesn't matter. Dance, music, it really doesn't matter to me. I'm trying to listen for those sounds of understanding of some of the most complex people that have been working, that have laid the path for us to ask ourselves as a mass of humans, the great and difficult questions of our time, which is, what is it to live in our bodies and in our skin? How do we do that? And how do we do that with compassion? How do we do that with depth and understanding? When I read Toni Morrison's Song of Solomon as a young girl, I read it on my knees. I could not get up off the floor. The same thing happened when I read I Serve the King of England. Reading Tolstoy for the first time, I can remember sitting in my bedroom in a little town. I was doing my undergraduate work at Cal Arts, reading this section of text, writing story by Tolstoy and Anna Karenina. And then after I read that chapter, where I realized that I could have been Anna, and I could have been the horse, and I could have been a spur, and I could have been a rain, and I could have been the dirt and the earth, I thought, when I realized that I was actually none of those things, and that I wasn't in 18th, 19th century Russia, but I was actually sitting in my bedroom in Newhall, California, the only thing I could do actually was put the book down and applaud. I sat there and I applauded for 5 minutes saying, oh my God, this is what art can do. This is what it is. It has extraordinary power, extraordinary ability to transform us, to take us into terrain and spaces that we never even imagined that was possible, which is, of course, the beauty and the dynamics of art that allows you to imagine the unimaginable, to place you in places and spaces that you did not know existed in your own human heart and in your own psyche. It's amazing. I remember reading Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Garden. It's one of the great, great, great texts. If you haven't read it, you should. What it must have been like to be an artist in our grandmother's time, she said, must be a story that is cruel enough to curl the blood. Why there have been no great women artists, and In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. I read these together as text, and I show them and I share them with my students. Laura Mulvey's, of course, Visual Pleasure, anchoring me early on within a set of sort of very important cultural ideas, political ideas, constructive and conceptual ideas around the female body. And the only problem that I had with Laurie's work was that it simply didn't include the Black body. It was an important theory, but it didn't include a body that had actually been made invisible historically. How to include that then became a process and a purpose for the kind of work that I would go on to make. Bertolt Brecht, of course, has been very important in any number of artists. Pina Bausch, I love dance. Pina Bausch, I love Pina Bausch. And then you sort of, these ideas about influence. I listen to these artists together often. Whether it's Frank Sinatra singing My Way or Nina Simone singing My Way. I like to listen to them in unison. I like to listen to what they bring together separately, how they construct meaning culturally for themselves and, of course, for an audience. And then, of course, there was the great Roy DeCarava. I've done a lot of work. And a lot of my work has actually been investigating what other artists have done. So I spend a lot of time making work of my own, but I spend a lot of time thinking about other artists. I've done many, 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 many interviews with other artists. Some of my first interviews were actually with people like Roy DeCarava, a whole host of other photographers who were living and working in New York at the time that I really needed to know about. I was a young artist, a young photographer, and I thought, well, who are the women? Where are they? Right? Where are they? Where are their voices? And what does that work look like? So I started sending out notices and information and flyers, asking women to send me their work. I was an undergraduate again in college. I had no money, and every time, once in a while, I'd be able to sort of scrape together like $7, and I'd go back off to the post office, and I'd buy another 40 stamps, and I would come back home, and I'd send out 40 letters. And I did the same thing with African-American photographers, women and African-Americans. I needed to know what they were doing. There was nothing about them in any of the history books, right? So doing that important work for me was very important. It's one of the ways in which I became familiar with Deborah Willis, my great friend, who was one of the artists who sent me work very early on, and I actually put Deborah in her first show. So doing that work and looking at other artists, understanding what they were doing, trying to not necessarily write about what they were doing because I'm not a writer, but to begin to organize material and organize exhibitions around what I was discovering, putting together lectures around what I was discovering was actually very important. And I continue that work. And the thing that's very interesting, the thing that you can't plan for, the unintended consequences of your actions, is that I then did all of these interviews, and now these interviews are starting to circulate in a very interesting way. Museums that didn't know that there was an audio recording with Roy DeCarava in 1980 are calling me to find out whether or not they might be able to use that text, or with Sean Walker, or with Buford Smith, or Lou Draper, Azure Cowan, Tony Barboza, Ming Smith, some of the early interviews, recorded interviews, are some of the interviews that I had with these artists. So I come back to artists and my love for artists often, and the way in which they have influenced me. Felix Gonzalez Torres, of course, was a powerful artist who taught me a great deal. And artists teach me a great deal about what it means to be an artist and how to work with the material that is at hand. Ana Mendieta, the sort of extraordinary work in which she uses her body constantly to rub up against the world in the earth. Or somebody like Adrian Piper, who decides to rub up against you as you move through space, sitting on a bus, walking down the street, painting yourself black and then rubbing up against somebody, spreading that around. Eleanor Anton, I can't remember exactly the name of this piece anymore. The Black Antonova, by Eleanor Anton. Same thing, playing with skin, changing skin. People like Sarah Z and these amazing pieces by Smith as well. Looking at, paying attention to the way in which artists are using form, addressing notions of media, the complicated structures of contemporary media, the way in which we use film and photography. I have a great story to tell you. I have become very close friends with Barbara Chase Rabeau, the great sculptor who no longer lives in the United States, but very, very important artist. Barbara was married to Marc Rabeau, who's on your right, and the other photograph is of Marc later in life. Marc was very, very good friends with Cartier-Bresson. Very, very important contemporary photographers of the 30s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, made incredible work. This is Barbara, beautiful, beautiful woman who married Marc when she was a young, raging beauty. She's just gorgeous. Now she lives with one of the most important contemporary photographers of the time. And he still worked for Magnum for years and years and years. Cartier-Bresson called him every single morning, for those of you who are photographers out there. Cartier-Bresson called Marc every single morning to wake him up because they worked together, they were great friends. Neither of them ever made a single photograph of Barbara Chase Rabeau. A great subject, a great artist who lived and worked amongst them constantly. And finally, one day when he was on the way out the door and Barbara was trying to get, her a photograph done for her book, she screamed down the hall as he was walking out the door. She said, "God damn it, come back here and take my picture." And so he came back and he made one photograph. He gave her the roll of film and said, "Get it processed." Now this becomes very, very interesting. This is actually a really interesting thing, and it has a lot to do with the way in which Barbara made her work, and of course, the work that I make contemporarily, that I look at women. These are all women artists that you are about to see, from Teresita Hernandez, Doris Salcido, who has an amazing exhibition that may have just closed at the Guggenheim, but it was one of their summer shows, this great crack in the world. Very important work, very deep work. And these things that, we have been influenced by with artists, right? Whether we're looking at the work of Cindy Sherman and the way in which she uses work, or we're looking at the work of Lorna Simpson. This idea of influence, of complicated influence, of looking back over art history and using art history, using great paintings in art history, using what men have really made in order to reimagine ourselves in contemporary work is absolutely incredible. And it goes on and on and on and on and on. Artists have used this constantly. There's this great influence, and I'm interested in the levels of those influences. So my influence comes also, right? I've always been interested for a long time in Manet, and I thought, I'm gonna bring that flower girl who was in the back, I'm gonna bring her forward. I'm going to bring her forward. I should have just kept making it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And maybe in some sort of weird way, I actually wind up doing that. And we were talking about this earlier, Sarah and I, about how these pieces were made. I know these young girls. I've worked with them for a really long time. The way in which they're framed, the way they're colored, that they're circular, hearkening back to a sort of 19th century form, right? That they're used with beveled glass, convex glass, so that there's a slight sort of sense of distortion and almost sort of magnification of their bodies, of themselves. I mean, there are all of these sort of interesting ideas that I'm interested in struggling with. This idea then, again, of influence, somebody like Michelin using similar subject matter and coming back to it again and again and again. The sort of neurotic and erotic and nude body that gets splayed before us over and over and over in the popular imagination and the male population. And I'm thinking about, the way in which Courbet sort of uses this body, right? His influence on somebody like Duchamp. Incredible. It's really incredible. It's the same thing, operating from a slight different angle, but the same thing. And then, of course, the way I then sort of incorporate that in my own work in looking at the female body. Disturbing, disruptive, decomposing, violated, etc. Not only do I work with photographs, but because I'm completely insane, and I don't have enough to do. I also have a small organization, and so I started a few years ago in order to sort of address issues of violence in my community, and so I have a little organization. It's called the Institute of Sound and Style, and I started this as a result of the violence that was taking place in my community. What was the way in which I could actually positively address what was happening? How do I keep kids safe? How do I involve them in other kinds of activities that actually encourage them to invest their know-how in something that they can actually live with and live by? I started with this idea that that we are responsible for our own community. And I did a series of billboard projects throughout the community, along the major boulevards and throughout the neighborhood itself where this violence had been happening, and then eventually opened up my institute called the Institute of Sound and Style, which is still going strong, and I'll probably ask you all for donations at the end. So I do that kind of work. I organize conferences and performances, lectures. I do a lot of different kinds of work along with making the photographs that I make, the artwork that I'm engaged in. These are some of the photographs, some of the installation views from the exhibition that was organized by the Frisch Center that traveled the country. The wonderful thing about seeing your work actually in this way in its installation, I have like 2 walls in my house, you know what I mean? So I really can't see the work. I can really only see the work really when the work is installed someplace or when the work is actually in books. So it's really the only time that I can really see what I've actually done and what that work sort of looks like and feels like, the depths of the work, when it's working, and sometimes, of course, when it fails. Because it really does do that, unfortunately. There are times it's like, oh, no wonder that's still in my basement. No wonder. So, it's a very interesting thing, because relative, to the amount of work that I've done, I basically produce 1 or 2 works every year. 1 or 2 works every year. And so I was speaking just the other night, actually, with Claudia Rankine, who wrote Citizen, which is out now. I hope that some of you have looked at this very important text, very beautifully written, thin volume. It's thin, but deep and intense. It takes her about 10 years, actually, to produce a work, And so she's laughing at me at this moment because we're realizing that I produce basically a couple of works a year. Sometimes they're successful, but again, it's true. 99% of the time, they are not failures, but they are not your best work. But what they are is absolutely necessary. And that it seems to me that one of the things that we do is one of the things that I do as an artist is just to really struggle with the conceptual ideas and with the frameworks. And so that making that work, whether it works or not, helps me get to another place of resolve. And so it's all simply a part of the process. It's all part of the process. And so for you young artists that are out there, holding on to your archive, being clear that you are actually in the process of developing an archive is absolutely essential. That you don't throw it away. Sometimes it's not necessarily meant to be seen by the outside world, but it's about your process, about what it is that you are making that gets you from point A to point B to point C. In doing this project for the Guggenheim, it was not only important for me to do the work, to show the work. The exhibition had taken us a number of years to organize, as I'm sure Sarah and Adrian knows. To do an exhibition takes years of planning, years of consideration, lots and lots of time, lots of going back and forth and negotiating and finding the materials and documenting them properly, so that you've spent 5 years, simply working towards that moment, that opening of organizing the catalog and bringing together all of the biographical material for that. There are all of these stages, all of these sort of things that, for the most part, you wish you didn't have to do. Go into making up an exhibition. So the exhibition had, by this time had been, organized. We had worked on it for, for those many years. And finally, I thought that it was time to really pay attention to the educational component of what I wanted to do. And so in this case at the Guggenheim, I put together a 4-day symposium and invited about 150 artists to join me over that period of time, putting together a series of lectures, long and short form. I really don't like panels very much. I don't think that they're very successful. So I tried to make a space then for every artist to have the floor to themselves, to push out a certain set of ideas. But we also did a series of concerts as well, both music concerts and dance concerts. And so a part of, what I think about is how do I engage space? How do I organize space? How do I organize a moment? How do I bring music and sound and voice and narrative and poetry and dance into a space and make it a part of a flowing whole? And so that is, this idea of sort of directing, of directing these sort of larger projects is something that I'm really, really very, very interested in. And I'm working on a new one right now, which is called Grace in the Pursuit of Democracy. And I can tell you more about that some other time. From the Kitchen Table series, work teaches me a great deal. And one of the things that I learned about myself in the process of making the Kitchen Table series was that indeed I was very much interested in the question of performance. That I wasn't really interested in Carrie as a subject, but I was interested in somebody like me as a subject that stood in for a broader breadth of of womanhood, of womanness, of, studying the sort of relationship between friend and friend, daughter and mother, man and woman. What happens in a space when it can be absolutely investigated, interrogated with a certain kind of light. Very, very simple forms. And then I went on, of course, to make text around it as well. Each piece each piece takes you to the next piece. If you are able to get out of the way of the work, it will open up pathways for you. Standing on shaky ground, I posed myself for a critical study, but was no longer certain of the questions to be asked. It was clear I was not Manet's type. Picasso, who had a way with women, only used me, and Duchamp never even considered me. But it could have been worse. Imagine my fate had de Kooning gotten hold of me. Seduced by one another, yet bound by certain social conventions, you framed me and I framed you, but we were both framed by modernism. And even though we knew better, we continued that time-honored tradition of the artist and his model. This sort of questioning, I think, ongoingly of the way in which we might be complicit in our own victimization is really important to me. That we are clear that you are conscious of the role in which you play in the life that you lead, and that you are making choices constantly about it. From here, I saw what happened and I cried. You became a scientific profile, a Negroid type, an anthropological debate, and a photographic subject. You became mammy, mama, mother, and then confidant. Ha. Descending the throne, you became foot soldier and cook. You became house, yard, fields, and kitchen. You became Uncle Tom, John, and Clemens Jim. You became writers and men of letters. For your names, you took hope and humble. Black and tan, your whipped wind of change howled low, blowing itself smack in the middle of Ellington's orchestra. Billy heard it too, and cried strange fruit tears. But your resistance was found in the food that you placed on the master's table. Ha. Born with a veil, you became root worker, juju mama, voodoo queen, hoodoo doctor. Some said you were the spitting image of evil. You became playmate to the patriarch and its daughter. You became an accomplice. And the music for God Bless the Child Who Has His Own. Out of deep rivers, mixed-matched mulattas, a variety of types, mind you, sprung up everywhere. You became the Joker's joke and anything but what you were. Ha. Some laughed long and hard and loud. And others said, well, the only thing a nigga can do for me is to shine my shoes. And you became Boots and Spades and Coons. And restless after the longest winter, you marched and marched and marched. And in your sing-song prayer, you asked, well, did my Lord deliver Daniel? And it was like, like working on this piece, it's just so amazing. And of course, there were all of these photographers that I needed to think about. There was a way in which I wanted to both engage photographic history, an understanding of photographic history, some of the pillars within photographic history, that I wanted to, to sort of talk about, not just, that I wanted to talk about the history of photography, and I wanted to talk about the history of representation, and I wanted to talk about the history of blacks within the representation of the history of photography. Sort of like, this sort of way of sort of, always trying to sort of strategize, a sort of way of moving around the sort of complex issue of representation. What is represented, and how is it represented, and how do we sort of take control of that representation? It was really sort of great. I had great conversations. I had conversations with, like artists, like Robert Frank, who I adore. It was just like a knockdown, drag out, about, whether or not I should or should not use his image in this context. It was really, really wonderful. So those kinds of things have been really important to me. Looking at the history of photography, looking at the history of representation, and coming back to that again and again from a number of different angles and strategies, really, that's employed within the work. Grabbing and snatching, blink and you be gone, a way of looking at the slave coast and the beginning of slavery, not, using the body. Because I think that something happens when we're always sort of referencing the body, but referencing those things that house the body. The material culture of the thing became really important to me. And so one of the things that, again, that I've learned about myself, I did not know that I was so completely in love with architecture until much later in my life when my photographs told me that I actually loved architecture. And of course, the thing about, being in a place like Mali and looking at this architecture is that it really tells us something about who belongs in a certain kind of space. Right? It's sort of the sexuality of buildings is completely inscribed in the architecture itself. We experience it in the West, of course, as well, but we experience it slightly differently. But it's there, right? The sort of the phallic building, right? The feminine space. And these ideas about feminine space and masculine space have been worked again and again and again, and there are actually some very, very interesting texts about them. So knowing that I was completely interested in architecture, I finally found myself in Rome. I thought that I was going to be like Gidget, and I realized at a certain point that I had gone to Rome as Gidget, 3 coins in the fountain and all of that I would have slept my way through the city, but I actually wouldn't have gotten any work done. So I'm actually really glad that I wound up going when I was 60 as opposed to when I was 16. It was very important because I really got a chance to really think about that space architecturally, very interested in the questions of power, the questions of state power, the way in which one was made to feel as they moved through the city of Rome in particular, right? That you were always aware that you were somehow or another, basking in the arms of the state. It was a very important part of architecture, looking at sort of like, these sort of first ways in which the notions of empire was beginning to express itself through a certain kind of architecture. And so I went back through this again and again and again. I worked every single day in Rome. And not only did I work on the streets in Rome and other parts of Italy as well, but I also worked at Cinecittà, which was really phenomenal, working in Fellini's old studio where I made a film called Italian Dreams. This is a section of San Lorenzo. This was the only section of Rome, actually, that was bombed during the war. The World War. It was very interesting. Also, the most militant and radical part of the city. This is, going up towards Mussolini's Rome, fascist Rome. And there's something very interesting about this, because often fascist Rome is really not spoken about very often. Or for that matter, the Jewish quarter and the Jewish sections of Rome, what they look like. I spent a lot of time in the Jewish section and in the fascist section of Rome, trying to understand something about the power of that architecture and how the body was made to feel in relationship to that architecture. And just as I was finishing up, as I said, every series leading to the next series, right? Just as I was finishing up in Rome, literally, it was like, I think this was like May Day, of 2006. Just as I was finishing in a garden, I stumbled out onto a museum, to the National Museum. I thought, oh. So suddenly I found myself zipping around Europe, photographing myself in front of all of these museums. Thinking about what was in and what was out. What was in and what was out. How do these buildings function? How do these institutions function? Right? What is included within them? Why is that inclusion there? What does one have to do in order to be there? Right? And when you're not included, then what does that mean for that institution? These are the kinds of questions that I'm asking myself as I negotiate this architecture. I'm always by myself. I photograph only by myself. Occasionally, once maybe, I've used somebody else. But normally, I'm up very early. I go out very early. I make my photographs very early. And then I come back home and I work for the rest of the afternoon. But moving through Europe and then, of course, coming to the United States. And now, of course, I'm becoming more and more interested as well in terms of what's going on inside these buildings and what does that look like. What are the interior structures of these places? What is the role of the Contemporary Museum? The Contemporary Museum is changing. It's changing, it's responding to its own historic moment as well that it should, and what that moment is and how we synthesize that is what we look for them to do. And how they will go on to do that, of course, is going to be really interesting and really fascinating. And a part of, a memory in time starts to speak to the ways in which contemporary photographers are using space and time, and the way in which, of course, then curators and art historians begin to think about and analyze what we are producing as artists, which is their job, their responsibility. Ours is simply to make the work. So I've been commissioned also to do a little bit of extra work in relationship to some of these, and I thought that I would do something here in Washington, D.C., and I've started photographing some of the monuments here. I'm hoping that I'll be able to photograph several of the more institutions here over the next couple of years. I have maybe about 10 photographs so far, but now I've got like another maybe a year to go before this work is done. And going to the Lincoln Monument, of course, right? If I'm thinking about my work, then I'm thinking about what I've made, and I'm thinking about what has been made in those spaces. Well, it only became important then that I would echo back to Marion herself as a first person, as a first moment that a Black woman stands at a space to give voice. So it was sort of a wonderful project. And of course, then we have Slow Fade to Black, which is all about the voicing of women, right? And the sort of slow fade to black, realizing that I'm like hearing these women less and less and less and less and less and less and less over time, these sort of enormous voices that gave us what we have as a great culture seems to be receding into the background. This hurts me, it saddens me. And so around these ideas, I make these other little projects about voicing. Listening devices. How do we hear? What are the tools that we hear with? Notions of color I come back to again and again and again. They reside in the work. As much as I'm interested in reframing lots of different issues and stories and ideas and conceptual references, I'm also very interested in how one might reframe color, reimagine color, that it's always exaggerated. It's never black and white. In fact, there's nothing really in life that is ever black and white. But we use that sort of as a metaphor constantly to talk about the tensions between things. I'd rather sort of think about it as being much more volatile and much more seductive than that. That it resides outside of black and white, that it has, a much more rich, a much more diverse way of engagement. So if nothing is, it's always, maybe we could say 50 Shades of Grey. Peeking out behind color. Peeking out behind color. I really, really love the work of Ellsworth Kelly and John Baldessari. So I'm interested in those color squares, in those rectangles that they've made, those. I'm interested in using them in this work, color, real, and imagine, sort of play around with these similar notions. Theirs, of course, primarily concerned with the tension between certain kinds of color and color field, and mine, in color theory. Working with scrim, room-size scrims. Right, so, there was a time when I just thought, I just cannot bear to be on a wall. I thought that it would be much more interesting to hang things in space. So I made these large, large pieces. There were 3 of them. I made 3 of them. One is Ritual and Revolution, the Hampton Project, which I think was my second piece, and then the Jefferson Project as well. All of them incorporating sound, always working with other musicians in order to compose original music for these pieces. So it's been like really kind of a wonderful way of working through a set of ideas, of a way of inviting the audience to walk with me through a certain kind of history, that you become both the participant and the observer in the work, that there is no barrier between you and the work, that you are in the work. Of the work, right? And so the viewer is constantly being aware of where they are positioned within the space of the work itself. It's been a really interesting thing to do. I love it, but it's still in my basement. I'm in love with Lincoln. I should know more about him than I do, but I'm in love with Lincoln. And so I did a project called Lonnie, Lincoln, and Me, and it's a video installation. Most of the work that I do actually comes with any number of videos attached to them or around them. I've done like many, I don't know, maybe 15, maybe 20, maybe less, maybe more, I'm not really sure, but lots. And this one is a room-size installation using, not hologram, but using a Pepper's Ghost, which was a 19th century invention that looks like a hologram. It was really, really wonderful. And it's a 3-part story that begins with looking at tensions around Lincoln, to tensions around a young man, to tensions around women. And I think that maybe it was shown, I think, at Prospect 3, and now it's going to Art Basel, and it's starting actually to take on a life of its own. And of course, the thing about being an artist is that, sometimes it really takes a long time for people to get with you. Right, Deb? The work can be around for a long time before people get with you. Because they're thinking about something that you made maybe 30 years ago, and you're thinking about what you made 30 days ago. And so there is a difference. But it's a really wonderful project, and I'm glad that it is starting to sort of take on a sort of life of its own. And that's one of the interesting things about work as well. I mean, the work really starts to take on a life of its own that in a way, once it enters like the public sphere, I don't really own it in the same way that I owned it before. And the only thing that I can really be sort of sure of is that I've made it, and that hopefully that I've made it with heart, that I've made it with determination, that I've made it with a kind of clarity. But I'm not really trying to figure out like all the answers before it goes out there. I was talking with somebody earlier. Oftentimes the work really teaches you a great deal about who you are and what you think and what you believe, but you only know that really after the fact. Sometimes it takes you a few years to catch up with your work, because a lot of times you're really working unconsciously. You're working out a set of desires, you're working out a set of fantasies, you're working out a set of positions, ideas that really matter to you, that are deeply concerning to you, that you are committed to struggling with. I decided at a certain point that I really needed to struggle through a set of assassinations that had happened in the country, right? The assassinations that happened in the country that made us who we are. And that I thought, well, there's no way really that, there was just no way that I could go forward unless I acknowledged that a part of the reason that we are as we are and how we are was based on a series of assassinations that happened in America, right? From, the killings at Kent State, to the assassination of Martin and the assassination of Malcolm and Medgar, and the assassination, of course, of the Kennedys. It's from Constructing History. So I really wanted to look at this very, very clearly in a constructed space and work with them. My gardens, a salute to Du Bois. I thought that perhaps I'll work with a florist, with a botanist, and we'll come up with a Du Bois peony, since I love peonies. And now My Hope peony is available through White Flower Farms, and you can plant hope in your garden anytime you want. I'm very excited about this project, and the idea is that it's going to go into the University of Mass. We'll be putting in a garden of them sometime soon, the next couple of years. And I'll just show you just this last piece, and if we have a moment, then we'll look at finally a final video. Again, I have all of these these interests. And last year, about this time, MoMA approached me about doing a study of their garden. They had invited 10 photographers to photograph their beautiful, beautiful garden, and the Philip Johnson Garden. And of course, I was one of the last artists that they asked to participate in the project. They had asked everybody else, and everybody else had started, and I was the last one to come sort of, straggling in, and they asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, well, what kind of budget do you have? And so he said, well, I mean, Carrie, that's not important. We shouldn't discuss budget. You should. So I said, well, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do. And he said, well, that's great. How much is that going to cost? And I said, well, how about $200,000? He said, that's not in our budget. So what I decided to do, as usual, is to bring together lots of people, and I restaged. I went through their archive, and I found photographs that I really responded to or had been significant moments that had happened in the garden, and I restaged those moments. I think maybe I invited about 150 people to hang with me over the course of a couple of weeks, on and off, to make these photographs, and they really are, in some instances, quite wonderful. They only needed 10 photographs for the book, so I sent them 75 and said, choose, select, make your selection. So they start rather quietly, of course. Just a view, understanding. I wanted to have little tigers in the garden, but I've got little pups. The up and coming, and other photographs that had been made in the garden that I reframed and placed inside the garden. and performances that had taken place in the garden with puppets. So I brought in a puppeteer and asked him to perform for me. Dances had taken place in the garden, so I asked a group of dancers to come along. They had built a tea house at one point in that fabulous, fabulous garden and invited a group of Japanese tea ceremonialists to perform within that space. And so I invited back a group of tea ceremonialists and photographed them within that space. The Philip Johnson 80th birthday party. So I reconstructed a whole bunch of hats and had people like Aggie Gunn and a whole group of artists, Fred Wilson and Whitfield and Joel Seinfeld and Shapiro, and just, you know, the whole wonderful group, Teresita Hernandez, Joel Wax, all of the gang coming together in order to make this really wonderful moment happen. Of course, jazz had been important in that space, and so I invited a group of jazz musicians and performers to perform in front of a crowd that I'd also invited to participate with me for the course of the day. A toy piano concert. Lovers. Yoga and exercise sessions. And now I think we're just going to show just a few minutes of a short video. It's 5 minutes long. It's called I Look at Women. A woman stands in the thaw of winter, the beginning of spring, reflecting, considering, imagining, contemplating the past, imagining the future. With one step, she could be in the future in an instant, or in the past, or in the moment, the now. But to get to now, to this moment, she needs to look back over the landscape of memory. Lost in memory, the woman faces history, a history with a story that has been told 1,000 times before. If you look on the horizon, here and there, first seen, now hidden, are little sightings of hope or dreams, of memories. If you look closely, through the corridors of time, even within the horror, one could see the fluttering wings of doves, wings like time, batting out beats of hope. Hope was the thing missed, the thing hoped for. You could almost taste it, but it was just out of reach, just above your head. I look at women. I look at them carefully. I look at them and I construct visual stories about our lives as women, as artists. I look at women in troubled spaces, in the troubled space of desire, their unrequited love, their identity shattered and whole. I listen, and I see the sounds made. I imagine the visual elements. It's an open territory, one with many doors, some leading to paths that dissipate, to women here and there who, on the journey, lost their way home, or who became exhausted by the effort, or who failed to understand the true price of the ticket and the related consequences, or who mismeasured themselves, others, and the situation at hand, or who have been refused and denied, mistreated, or who have been driven, if not out, certainly mad. Together, we look into a past that binds us, into a history composed of memories, acts, and deeds. A history often written by others, a history that has left little room for the likes of her. And so she invents. She carves a space for herself in a world dominated by men, men with muscle. The path is not straight, but there are signposts in the form of echoes stored in the deep recesses of the mind that can be gathered and harnessed when needed, like now. If you focus, you can see it clearly. Your memory, your historical memory, your cultural memory, reinscribing, reinforcing what you know, what you believe, what you imagine, what you want, what you need, what you missed, what you said, what you did, what you heard.